Hey guys, tonight we begin with something truly foul. Not knights, not kings, but the people crawling through sewers with sacks full of squeaking nightmares. The Middle Ages were filthier than you think, and tonight you're not a hero, you're the rat catcher. So before you get cozy, I'd really appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps way more than you know. And hey, I'm always curious where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment with your city and what time it is for you. Now lay back, close your eyes, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You hear them before you see them. The scratching of tiny claws in the rafters, the squeaking from the corners, the faint thump of something knocking over your family's only wooden bowl. Your bed is a half-rotted pile of straw stuffed with lice, fleas, and hay, so filthy it crunches when you shift. Blankets are stiff with grime. The smell? A pungent blend of sweat, goat, and mouldy bread. You sit up, and a rat scurries across your toes like it's late for work, and then it hits you. That's your job. You're not a farmer or a craftsman. You're the one unlucky soul the town calls when the vermin get too bold. You are a medieval rat catcher, which means your workday starts the same way it always does, with fleas biting your ankles before you've even stood up. Rat catchers existed because rats were everywhere. Granaries, stables, taverns, houses, even churches. No building was safe, and with rats came fleas, and with fleas came the Black Death. By the mid-14th century, entire towns were emptied out, whole families gone in days. People eventually noticed that fewer rats meant fewer funerals, and suddenly your filthy trade wasn't just pest control, it was survival. The irony? They needed you, but they despised you. You smell like the creatures you hunt. Your sack is stained with blood and fur. Your cloak reeks of sewer water. Children point, adults cross themselves, and no tavern bench is ever warm for you. You're tolerated, but only in the same way a man would tolerate a bucket full of manure that also happens to keep his house from flooding. Your tools are laughably crude. A wooden trap that squeaks louder than it snaps. A stick heavy enough to bludgeon, light enough to carry. A scruffy dog that barks at everything except the actual rats. And if you're lucky, a ferret. A wriggling, hissing missile you shove into burrows to flush the vermin out. It's medieval pest control at its finest. Think of it as hiring a furry torpedo with teeth. You spend your day crawling under barns, wading into sewers, and sticking your arms into holes you can't see the bottom of. Every rustle might be a rat, or a snake, or the kind of insect that looks like it belongs in a nightmare. Each time you shove your hand into the dark, you're gambling with plague. Fleas don't care about your career path. One bite, and you're coughing blood in a ditch by the week's end. The work is endless. Rats breed faster than anyone can kill them. You trap 10 today, 20 appear tomorrow. Some towns even offered bounties, proof of dead rats traded for a handful of coins. The catch? You had to carry the corpses around with you until payday. Imagine walking through town with a sack full of rotting, flea-infested trophies, while praying no one sneezes in your direction. Romantic, isn't it? The soundscape of your life is squeaks, snarls, and the snap of traps. The smell is decay. The feel is damp fur brushing against your bare skin. And all the while, the people you protect recoil when you pass. They might not say it out loud, but to them, you're no better than the creatures you hunt. And just when you think it couldn't get more absurd, it does. Because rats weren't always killed outright. Sometimes they were kept alive for entertainment, tossed into pits with dogs for sport, or hung up in marketplaces as warnings like tiny squeaking criminals. And if you were really unlucky, you were the one ordered to set it up. You hear the bells of the church toll in the distance, echoing over the town. It's either another funeral or just a reminder of how close you are to ending up in one. Your sack wriggles at your side. One of your catch is still alive, gnawing at the burlap. A flea leaps from its fur to your arm. You slap at it, knowing deep down that you can't possibly kill them all. And yet, the town will call you again tomorrow. Because as disgusting, dangerous and degrading as this life is, the alternative is worse. Without you, the streets would belong to the rats entirely. But if you think catching them was bad, wait until you learn what people actually did with the rodents afterward. because their fate wasn't always as simple as a quick end. The sack on your shoulder wriggles with something still alive and you keep walking, because for you, carrying rats is as ordinary as carrying bread. The tools of your trade hang heavy at your side, crude and unreliable. There was no Home Depot for pest control in the 14th century, only the imagination of desperate men and the occasional advice from a farmer who swore by some bizarre method he learned from his grandfather. What you end up with is a collection of traps, sticks, ferrets and dogs, none of which are guaranteed to work, but all of which guarantee that you will smell terrible. One of the most common rat-catching tools was the spring trap, a wooden contraption that was supposed to snap shut with enough force to hold a rat in place. More often than not, it squeaked, slammed shut too early, and left you with nothing but a mocking echo and a rat scampering off to tell his friends. There were also cage traps, little wooden boxes baited with scraps of bread or rancid cheese. Once a rat wandered inside, a door would drop shut behind it. That worked if the rat was feeling particularly gullible, which was rare, because medieval rats had more survival instinct than most humans. When traps failed, you relied on your animals. Dogs, usually small terriers, were bred and trained to snap at the rodents with astonishing speed. They would leap into a pile of hay, come out with a writhing rat in their jaws and shake it until it stopped moving. Ferrets were the secret weapon, long and narrow, able to slip into the tiniest crevices. You stuffed one into a rat hole, and within moments it flushed out a panicked rodent into your waiting trap or your waiting hands. But ferrets were unpredictable. Sometimes they chased out the rats. Sometimes they disappeared into the walls and never came back. Either way, you had to explain yourself to the furious householder who wanted the problem gone yesterday. Bait was its own science. People believed rats hated certain herbs, so catchers smeared traps with pennyroyal, mint, or camphor oil, as if aromatherapy would suddenly convince vermin to surrender. Others swore by the opposite, using rancid meat or mouldy bread to lure them out. You had to be careful, though, because anything rotten enough to tempt a rat was usually rotten enough to make you gag. The stench followed you like a second shadow, seeping into your cloak, your hair, your beard, until even the dogs refused to sit too close. But it was never just about catching the rats. It was about surviving the consequences of chasing them. Crawl into a medieval grain store, and you might find a nest the size of a hay bale, teeming with hundreds of tiny bodies, eyes glowing in the dark. Step into a barn, and you risked being bitten by something carrying more than just fleas. Rabies was a very real danger. Rat bites were nasty enough on their own, swelling, festering, and filling with pus. But if you were unlucky, you might start foaming at the mouth and snarling before being buried at the edge of the village, with a rock on your chest to keep your cursed body down. The church had its own ideas about rats. Some clerics argued that infestations were a punishment from God, meant to remind humans of their sins. Others claimed rats were demons in disguise, slipping through cracks to test the faithful. That meant your job, in their eyes, was half practical and half spiritual. You were not only saving food stores, you were wrestling with manifestations of the devil himself. Imagine trying to demand fair wages while also being told you were technically battling Satan with a stick and a dog. It did nothing for your social standing. The plague added another layer of misery. People began to notice that wherever rats gathered, death seemed to follow. They did not yet understand fleas carried the bacterium Yersinia pestis, but they knew enough to fear the rodents. This turned you, the rat catcher, into something both useful and terrifying. Town officials wanted your help. Farmers begged for your services, but the rest of society held you at arm's length. To touch you was to brush too close to disease. You were essential, but untouchable. Even when you were paid, the money was insulting. A few pennies here, a loaf of bread there, sometimes a mug of ale if the family felt generous. More often, they looked you in the eye and insisted you should be doing God's work for free. After all, wasn't pestilence itself a divine curse? Why should they pay you for chasing away what the Lord had sent? This left you not only impoverished, but also constantly hungry. You were surrounded by vermin that devoured food stores, while you yourself scraped by on stale bread crusts and sour beer. the absurdity never stopped. Some towns offered official rat bounties, demanding proof of your kills. This meant you had to carry severed tails or whole corpses to the local hall, where a clerk would count them one by one and hand you your payment. Naturally, people cheated. Enterprising peasants bred rats in secret, chopped the tails and doubled their earnings. Others cut tails from cats, hoping the clerk would not notice the difference. These scams made your already miserable job even worse, because now you were competing with counterfeit rat hunters who stayed clean while you crawled through filth. Superstition added yet another burden. People believed rats were tied to omens. Killing too many at once might anger unseen spirits. Sparing one might invite luck. If a rat squealed too loudly as it died, some thought it was calling curses on the household. You had to navigate not only the infestation, but also the endless swirl of beliefs that turned each rat into a miniature apocalypse. It was exhausting, and it was dangerous, but it was also strangely permanent. Rats never went away. They were woven into the fabric of medieval life, and so were you, whether anyone wanted you there or not. By the end of a long day, your sack is heavy, your arms are scratched, and your legs itch from flea bites. You stagger home reeking of sweat, mildew, and decay, knowing tomorrow will be no different. The scratching of claws will wake you, the squeak of rodents will follow you, and the work will never end. And still, the people you protect will mutter when you pass, as if you are carrying the plague itself. Yet even with all the filth, all the danger, all the indignity, your job was still only half the story. Because catching the rats was one thing, deciding what to do with them afterward was something else entirely, and that part was where things got truly bizarre. Your sack is full, the writhing inside is quieted, and the day's work seems complete. But catching the rats was never the end of the story. In medieval Europe, everything had to have a purpose, even vermin. What you did with the bodies could mean money, suspicion, entertainment, or in some cases outright horror. To the medieval mind, rats were not just pests, they were currency, warnings, punishments, and sometimes food when desperation gnawed harder than hunger itself. One of the simplest uses for dead rats was proof of labour. Towns plagued with infestations often required rat catchers to present their kills as evidence before being paid. Sometimes tails were collected as tokens, counted like grim little receipts. The problem was that this system quickly turned into a marketplace of fraud. Rats were bred in secret by enterprising peasants who sold their tails over and over, while others snipped tails from cats and tried to pass them off. It became a strange form of economy, where vermin were transformed into coin, a currency no one wanted to touch, but everyone wanted to claim. But beyond being proof of service, rats were also used for display. In marketplaces, strung-up rat corpses were nailed to doors or hung from rafters as public warnings. They were meant to say, "Look, the infestation is being handled," or at least someone is trying. It was the medieval version of pest control marketing, except instead of a logo on a van, you had a row of dangling carcasses attracting flies. Sometimes rats were buried in shallow pits outside of town, though this often just created a new feast for other rats. In some cases they were burned in piles, the acrid smoke rising over villages as if signalling victory, though it probably did more to fumigate lungs than streets. Rats also found their way into medieval punishments. There are recorded cases of rats being used as instruments of torture, placed inside small cages strapped to human skin, with the cage heated from the outside. The panicked rodent, desperate to escape, clawed its way into flesh. This gruesome method was not an everyday occurrence, but it was notorious enough to linger in chronicles as one of the darker footnotes of medieval cruelty. To live as a rat catcher was to know that your prey might not only be killed, but weaponized in spectacles of pain. Then there was entertainment. Rats were tossed into pits with dogs for blood sport. Crowds gathered to watch as the animals were ripped apart, cheering for the canine champions and betting on the numbers of kills. It was a cheap thrill for people with little else to pass the time, and it turned your work into part of a spectacle. Every rat you delivered alive could end up in an arena, where its squeals blended with the roar of gamblers. For you, it meant more coin, but at the cost of becoming the supplier of misery as much as its solution. Superstition wove through all of it. Some believed rats carried omens, that their sudden death in large numbers foretold plague or fire. Others thought preserving their bodies could ward off bad luck, leading to the strange practice of hanging dried rats in barns as charms. It was a contradiction. Kill them for survival, but keep them for protection. You became not just a catcher, but a curator of charms, handing over carcasses to farmers who tucked them into rafters like talismans. In the most desperate times, rats were not destroyed at all. They were eaten. Chronicles from famine-stricken regions tell of families boiling rats when grain ran out, stripping them for whatever meat they offered. It was survival, brutal and degrading, but proof that hunger erased disgust. And while you might have felt repulsion, you also knew that every dead rat in your sack could be sold not just to a town clerk or an arena, but to a starving family willing to pay for meat that twitched only hours before. For the church, rats carried symbolic weight. Their bodies sometimes ended up on altars as examples of impurity, or were cast into rivers in ritual gestures meant to cleanse communities. The irony was sharp. The same clergy that called you a necessary evil also demanded your catches to fuel sermons about sin. Each rat became a lesson, each tale a metaphor, each pile of corpses a reminder that humanity itself was crawling with corruption. The disposal of rats was never simple. It was political, religious, economic, and disgusting all at once. Some lords demanded that rats be buried on their lands, claiming ownership even over vermin. Some towns held contests of destruction, piling rodents high and setting them ablaze in public squares, turning pest control into community theatre. You were always in the middle of it, sweating, stinking, trying to hold your ground as both servant and outcast. And when the night finally came, the town quieted and your sack was empty. The scratching never stopped. New rats had already moved in, replacing those you had caught. Your work was never finished. The disposal fires smouldered, the pit dogs slept, and the charms dangled from rafters, but the creatures were always waiting. You knew that every corpse you hauled away was just a temporary gesture against the tide. Rats were not pests to be eradicated. They were a constant, a shadow over every medieval meal, every granary, every bed. Your life was a cycle of catching, killing and disposing, and none of it brought you peace. Even when you tried to sleep, the smell of singed fur or rotting bodies clung to you. Rats defined your waking hours and they haunted your nights. Society depended on your work, yet recoiled from your presence. You were a man paid to deal with what no one else would touch, and the results of your labour were paraded, buried, burned or devoured, but never forgotten. And yet, the strangest part was not how they disposed of the rats you caught, but what the infestations themselves revealed about medieval life. For rats thrived where humans were weakest, which meant to understand your work fully, you had to understand the filth, the food, and the structures that made medieval towns the perfect paradise for vermin. The truth is that rats only thrived because medieval towns practically rolled out the red carpet for them. Every wall, every roof, every cellar was built as if designed with vermin in mind. Your work as a rat catcher was not just about chasing creatures through barns, it was about wrestling with the very environment that kept breeding them. And medieval environments were nothing short of rodent utopias. Start with food. Granaries were poorly sealed, with wooden boards full of gaps and cracks wide enough for a rat to stroll through like it owned the place. Farmers stored grain in sacks, but sacks were made of rough cloth that shredded easily under sharp teeth. Rats chewed through them in minutes, feasting on barley, wheat and oats meant to feed entire families. In some cases, a single rat population could eat away a third of a storehouse, which was enough to plunge a village into famine. The rodents did not just nibble either. They contaminated everything they touched, leaving droppings that carried parasites, urine that stank so badly even starving people hesitated, and fleas that carried invisible death. Waste disposal made the problem worse. Medieval streets were open sewers, flowing with human waste, animal dung and kitchen scraps. Every time someone shouted Gardilou before tossing a chamber pot out the window, the rats heard it as an invitation. Food was literally landing at their feet. Piles of rotting vegetable peels, spoiled meat and sour ale created buffets so lavish that rodents multiplied faster than anyone could count. There were no garbage collectors, no sewage systems, only mud lanes packed with filth. Rats nested right in the street, gnawing at refuse while townsfolk stepped carefully to avoid losing a boot in the muck. Then there were the homes themselves. A peasant hut was little more than a single room with a thatched roof, and walls made of wattle and daub, a mixture of mud and straw. Every crack was a tunnel for rodents. Thatch itself made the perfect nesting ground, a warm and dry place where rats could burrow unseen. Families slept inches away from infestations, separated only by flimsy walls and straw bedding already crawling with fleas. The sound of scratching in the night was as normal as the sound of snoring, and unlike the people, the rats always had food, warmth and company. Even castles, which were supposed to be the pinnacle of medieval architecture, were riddled with vermin. Stone walls were no protection. Grain stores in castles were enormous, offering more food than a rodent colony could ever dream of. Guard robes, the medieval toilets that dropped waste directly into moats, were essentially giant invitations for rats to crawl back up. The nobility might have had tapestries and feasts, but they also had rodents dancing across their banquet tables when the servants looked away. Wealth did not mean cleanliness, it simply meant better fed vermin. Markets became another breeding ground. Stalls overflowed with goods, from fish packed in salt to meat hanging in the open air, buzzing with flies. Nothing was refrigerated and nothing was safe from a hungry rat bold enough to climb up the wooden posts. Merchants swatted with sticks, but for every rat chased away, 3 more appeared. Markets meant crowds, and crowds meant food scraps dropped underfoot. A rat catcher might patrol the edges, but it was like bailing water from a sinking ship with a wooden spoon. The church even contributed unknowingly. Monasteries stored great quantities of bread, ale, and wine, all vulnerable to rodents. Monks who preached against sin were forced to watch rats gnaw at their holy supplies. Some believed the infestations were a form of divine punishment, though the punishment suspiciously always seemed to involve granaries bursting with food and not the barren huts of peasants. Others adopted cats within monastery walls, but cats only did so much. Rats adapted, bred, and returned in greater numbers. Water supplies also turned into highways for vermin. Wells dug in towns often collected runoff from waste-filled streets, and rivers doubled as both water sources and garbage dumps. Rats swam through them easily, travelling from one settlement to the next like furry merchants of disease. Even ships carried infestations, spreading rodents across regions faster than any human could manage. By the time one town thought it had the problem under control, another wave of vermin had already arrived with the next shipment of goods. What this meant for you, the rat catcher, was endless work. You could empty your traps in the morning, burn a pile of corpses by noon, and still find the same house re-infested by evening. The towns themselves were breeding grounds, and your trade was a losing battle against human habits more than rodent cunning. If people had sealed their grain properly, built sewage systems or cleaned their streets, rats might have been manageable. Instead, the Middle Ages turned every home and every street into a banquet hall for vermin. The irony was that rats thrived precisely because humans were trying to survive. Every loaf of bread, every stored sack of oats, every attempt at keeping food through winter created more opportunities. Rats and humans lived in lockstep, one thriving off the other, and you were stuck in between. You were the thin, smelly line trying to keep infestations from consuming entire harvests. It was work that never ended, because the very structures of society made it impossible to win, and even if you managed to clear one house, the residents often undid your work within hours. Scraps left on the floor, refuse tossed in the street, grain sacks left unsealed. You could almost hear the rats laughing at you from their burrows. For them, Medieval life was paradise. For you, it was a nightmare you could never escape. But infestations were not just about ruined food or spoiled markets. They had consequences that stretched far deeper into society, shaping public health, law, and even the way entire cities were governed. Which meant your miserable job as a rat catcher was tied not just to households and barns, but to the survival of communities themselves. When rats became too numerous to ignore, towns did what towns always did in the Middle Ages. They wrote rules, and like most medieval rules, they were ambitious, poorly enforced, and often laughed at by the very people they were meant to control. As a rat catcher, you were tangled in this web of ordinances, fines, and half-baked regulations that promised to make your job easier, but usually just left you dragging your sack through the same filthy alleys. One of the earlier strategies was waste control. Cities issued laws forbidding people from dumping refuse directly into the streets, which would have been revolutionary if anyone had bothered to obey them. Theoretically, every household was supposed to carry waste outside of town to be disposed of properly. In practice, people opened their shutters at night, muttered gardy-loo, and hurled their buckets into the lanes. The evidence piled up quickly. Rats multiplied faster, and you were called back to the same houses week after week. Markets were a constant headache for lawmakers. Ordinances declared that meat must be sold fresh, bread must be stored properly, and spoiled goods were not to be left on display. None of this addressed the real problem, which was that rats did not wait for spoiled goods. They gnawed on fish, bread, and sausages while they were still fresh, leaving behind droppings that no inspector wanted to examine too closely. City officials fined vendors when infestations were obvious, but those same vendors slipped coins into the hands of inspectors to look the other way. It was corruption, feeding corruption, and in the middle of it all, rats kept feasting. Grain storage attracted special attention. Lords and town councils decreed that granaries must be sealed, sacks kept elevated off the ground, and doors fitted with iron hinges. These instructions read impressively on parchment, but ignored the realities of wood warped by damp, sacks chewed through overnight, and iron hinges that cost more than a farmer's annual profit. By the time anyone checked compliance, the grain was already riddled with holes and trails of droppings, and so you were summoned again, ferret in hand, to crawl into storehouses that smelled like a mixture of bread and death. Punishments for failing to follow sanitation rules were often theatrical. In some towns, bakers caught selling rat-infested bread could be pilloried in the market square. Tavern owners whose barrels showed gnaw marks might face public shaming or steep fines. But the shame never stuck. Everyone knew the problem was universal, and while one man might be punished today, his neighbour would be guilty tomorrow. Rats made criminals of everyone, and the cycle of rules and fines churned endlessly without results. Then came the plague years. Panic drove lawmakers to issue stricter decrees. Streets had to be cleared of waste, animal carcasses were to be buried outside city walls, and rat catchers were to be given greater authority. But with half the population dead or dying, the enforcement collapsed. Guards fled their posts, officials shut themselves in their homes, and once again the streets filled with filth. For you, this meant more work and more danger. Fleas carrying the plague thrived in the chaos, and every rat you caught felt like holding a loaded weapon in your hands. Some cities tried more organised responses. Nuremberg, for example, was famous for its elaborate system of fines and inspectors. Waste disposal was supposed to be monitored, and special workers were hired to clean the streets. But even Nuremberg struggled, because rats did not care about paperwork. They bred in cellars, beneath floorboards, and in the thatch above bedrooms. They travelled in carts and ships, spreading from one city to another faster than any inspector could keep pace. The church added its own layer of laws, mixing morality with pest control. Infestations were sometimes blamed on sin, and ordinances required prayers or processions to drive out vermin. Bells were rung, relics paraded, and holy water sprinkled in granaries. You could stand there, holding your traps, watching clergy wave incense over a pile of droppings, and wonder if anyone noticed the rats darting behind them. Religion offered comfort, but it did nothing to stop the scratching in the walls. There were even attempts at biological regulation. Cats were encouraged in towns, with ordinances praising households that kept them. But cats could only do so much. Rats bred faster than any predator could consume, and cats themselves became symbols of superstition. In some regions, they were accused of witchcraft and killed, leaving rats to multiply unchecked. The laws of men and the laws of nature collided, and nature always won. As rat catcher, these ordinances shaped your life in strange ways. On one hand, they kept demand for your services high. Every fine, every failed inspection, every sermon about pestilence meant another call for your work. On the other hand, they kept you trapped in an endless cycle, because no law ever truly solved the problem. People broke the rules, inspectors ignored them, and rats thrived regardless. You were not just fighting vermin, you were fighting human nature, laziness, corruption, and ignorance, all while being blamed for smelling like the very creatures you chased. By the end of the day, you learned to laugh at the laws. They were ink on parchment, while you were knee-deep in sewage swinging traps at shadows. The gap between written order and lived chaos was the space where you survived. You knew the towns would keep writing rules, the clergy would keep blessing grain stores, and the rats would keep chewing through everything. And through it all, your sack would keep filling, heavier with every step, proof that no law could ever keep vermin from thriving. Yet if rules could not save medieval people from rats, something else did step in to shape the story. It was not parchment or punishment, but the spread of plague itself that forever tied your miserable trade to history. And that plague would turn rat-catching from a thankless chore into a profession seen as both necessary and cursed, changing the way people viewed your kind for centuries. The rules of towns and the sermons of priests may have tried to deal with rats, but when plague arrived, all pretenses collapsed. The Black Death spread faster than any ordinance, sweeping across Europe like a storm that cared nothing for parchment or prayer. And in the middle of it all, your profession suddenly mattered more than anyone could have imagined. You were still shunned, still filthy, still despised, but now you were also one of the few standing between life and total collapse. The irony was that the very creatures you hunted were also the ones defining your reputation, as if your identity had been bound by the squeak of claws and the jump of fleas. By the mid-14th century, the plague had claimed millions. Entire towns vanished, villages stood empty, and churchyards overflowed with shallow graves. The connection between rats, fleas, and death was imperfectly understood, but people noticed enough to fear vermin more than ever. A rat infestation no longer meant spoiled grain or chewed floorboards. It meant sickness. It meant funerals. It meant the end of families in less than a week. Suddenly, rat catchers were called for more than protection of food. You were now considered a strange form of defense against death itself, even if no one wanted to stand too close to you. The fleas riding on rats carried Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind bubonic plague. Each bite was invisible doom, a microscopic horror medieval people could not comprehend. They blamed miasma, or bad air, believing foul smells spread the disease. They burned herbs, carried posies, wore strange masks, all in an attempt to purify the air. None of this stopped the true carriers, the fleas that leapt easily from fur to fabric, which meant every time you dragged your sack of rats through town, you were technically parading the disease on your shoulders, even as people paid you to keep it away. Fear reshaped your work. Households begged for your services, pressing coins into your hand with trembling fingers. Farmers brought you into their barns at midnight, whispering prayers as you set your traps. Markets offered rewards for every rodent caught, promising extra bread for proof of extermination. But the gratitude was hollow. People stared as if you carried death itself, and many crossed themselves when you left. You were essential, but also cursed, trapped in a profession that made you both protector and pariah. The worst part was the corpses. Rats did not just die in traps or under your stick. They died in streets, barns, homes and sewers, piling up faster than anyone could remove them. Some believed their sudden deaths were omens, that vermin could sense plague before humans. Others thought their bodies attracted the disease, forcing catchers to burn them in great heaps. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of charred fur, rot and smoke that clung to your skin for days. Every time you inhaled, you wondered if you were breathing in the same death that had already claimed your neighbours. Cities reacted with desperation. Some issued public bounties, paying handsomely for every rat tail turned in. Others tried to fumigate entire neighbourhoods with smoke, filling streets with choking clouds in hopes of suffocating the vermin. These measures failed spectacularly, but they created endless work for you. The more people panicked, the more they called you, and the more you dragged yourself through alleys and cellars, armed with nothing but crude traps and a muttering sense of doom. The church, too, folded rat catching into its theology. Infestations were preached as a punishment for sin, and the plague was framed as divine wrath. Sermons warned that vermin thrived where morality failed. Yet those same churches employed you to clear their granaries and kitchens, making sure their monks had bread and ale even as they denounced you from the pulpit. It was hypocrisy wrapped in incense, and you learned to endure it with bitter humour. The irony grew sharper when rumours spread that rat catchers themselves were carriers. Some whispered that you were spreading plague by hauling your sacks from house to house, leaving fleas in your wake. Others accused you of witchcraft, insisting that no one could survive so close to disease without being cursed. Your work, once ignored, became a focus of suspicion, and there were times when rat catchers were beaten or driven out of towns, only to be begged back days later when infestations grew unbearable. You lived in a cycle of demand and rejection, your very existence tied to a fear no one could escape. Even the clothing you wore betrayed you. Ragged cloaks stained with fur and blood marked you as different. Fleas hid in the folds, biting you endlessly as you worked. Many catchers bore the scars of their trade, their skin pocked with sores, their arms mottled with old wounds from scratches and bites. And while some survived, others fell victim to the very plague they were hired to fight. It was a profession where every coin earned came with the possibility of coughing blood the next week, your body abandoned in a pit alongside those you had tried to protect. Yet somehow, despite all of this, the work continued. Towns could not ignore the scratching in the walls, the movement in the grain sacks, the gnawing in the rafters. Rats thrived even as people died, and your trade persisted. You walked through streets where every second house bore a plague mark on its door, yet still you carried your traps, still you loosed your ferrets, still you swung your stick. The work was relentless, the fear constant, but society could not let you vanish. Without you, the balance between humans and vermin would have tipped even further into catastrophe. The Black Death reshaped your identity forever. Before, you were a filthy tradesman. After, you were tied eternally to plague. Even when the worst had passed, the association lingered. Rat catchers became symbols of death as much as of survival. Every squeak in the rafters, every shadow in the corner of a granary reminded people not only of hunger, but of the graves that filled too quickly. You carried that weight in your sack, in your smell, in your reputation, long after the plague's wave had ebbed. And though the plague had changed your trade, it had also exposed something larger. Rats were not just nuisances. They were clues to the failures of human society, to the way towns were built, food was stored, and waste was managed. You were not just catching rodents. You were navigating the failures of an entire civilization. And when panic subsided and life returned to its filthy normal, you discovered something even more unsettling. For rats were never just pests or symbols of death. They became woven into the very fabric of medieval culture, finding their way into folklore, superstition, and the strange stories people told to explain a world that rarely made sense. Even after plague years passed and the fires of panic cooled, rats never lost their shadow. They were too deeply etched into the imagination of medieval people. Every scratch in the rafters, every flick of a tail across the floorboards carried more weight than just a pest problem. Rats were transformed in the collective mind into creatures of superstition, omens of things to come, and symbols of both luck and doom. And you, trudging through alleys with your sack of vermin, became entangled not just in filth, but in folklore. Medieval superstition held that rats could foretell disaster. A sudden swarm of them fleeing a house was taken as a sign that fire or plague was near. Sailors watched the decks carefully, believing that if rats abandoned ship, the vessel was doomed to sink. These beliefs gave your work an extra layer of dread. Catching too many rats at once sometimes sparked whispers that catastrophe was around the corner, as if you yourself had unleashed fate by emptying a cellar. To the medieval mind, vermin were not only nuisances, they were messengers of the unseen. Then there were the rat kings. Tangled masses of rats with their tails knotted together, discovered occasionally in barns or cellars, were treated with a mix of horror and awe. Today, scholars debate whether these rat kings were natural accidents caused by sticky substances or carefully staged hoaxes. But in the medieval period, they were believed to be symbols of evil, embodiments of demonic influence, or portents of plague. Imagine hauling one of those writhing, squeaking bundles in your sack, knowing the villagers would regard it less as a cluster of animals and more as a cursed object. It was not just vermin control, it was artifact collection for a culture obsessed with signs. Folklore wove rats into morality tales. They were depicted as thieves, gnawing through grain as punishment for human greed. In some stories, rats were described as the souls of the unworthy, reincarnated to scurry through muck for eternity. Priests warned that infestations could be divine punishment, while peasants muttered that killing too many at once might anger unseen spirits. You found yourself caught between science that did not exist and superstition that refused to die, your every action framed as either salvation or provocation. And rats were not always seen as entirely evil. In some corners of Europe, they were treated with a strange form of respect. Farmers sometimes left offerings of grain to appease local rat colonies, believing that generosity might convince the vermin to leave the rest of the harvest untouched. This, of course, did nothing but fatten the colonies, ensuring even more of your services were needed. Yet these rituals persisted, turning your trade into something absurdly ceremonial. One day you were shoving a ferret into a burrow. The next you were watching a family scatter oats at the edge of their field like they were hosting a feast for their enemies. The church added another layer by folding rats into the language of sin. Vermin gnawing at food became metaphors for temptation, gnawing at the soul. Sermons compared their hidden burrows to secret vices, their sudden swarms to unchecked greed. Yet even as rats became symbols in sermons, the monasteries storing bread and cheese still hired you quietly to clear their pantries. Symbolism was lofty, but hunger was practical, and vermin chewed through both scripture and sackcloth without discrimination. Tales of vermin vengeance also crept into folklore. One story told of a village that killed every rat it could find, only to be overrun weeks later by an even larger swarm, as if the creatures were exacting revenge. Another warned that drowning rats in wells would poison the water, a superstition that mingled fear with practical truth, since rotting carcasses could contaminate supplies. You lived in a world where every method of extermination risked being turned into a cautionary tale, and every scratch in the night could become a ghost story by morning. The most famous legend of all was the Pied Piper of Hamelin, a tale that grew in retelling across the centuries. A mysterious figure lured rats out of a town with the sound of a pipe, only to turn his tune on the townspeople's children when they refused to pay. For you, the story was both irritating and ironic. While you sweated in cellars and waded through muck with your sack of fleas, a fantasy musician supposedly did your job with a song. It was folklore's way of erasing the smell of your work and replacing it with something magical, even though reality smelled more like sewage than song. Superstitions also dictated how you were treated. People sometimes avoided speaking your name, fearing it would attract more rats. Others demanded that you burn every rat you caught, convinced their spirits would return if buried. Still others required you to leave the bodies at crossroads, a place where evil was thought to scatter. These rituals turned your daily labour into a kind of grim performance, where every disposal became part of a stage play directed by fear and imagination. Even your animals were touched by superstition. Ferrets were regarded with suspicion, their slinking movements compared to demons. Dogs that killed too many rats were sometimes believed to have taken on the spirit of the vermin themselves, and unlucky catchers were warned to put down their hounds before they grew cursed. You worked with tools and animals that were as feared as the creatures they hunted, turning your profession into a carnival of suspicion, where every participant was guilty by association. By the time you returned home at night, you carried not only the smell of vermin, but the weight of all these beliefs. You were not merely catching rats, you were wrestling with demons, omens, curses, and stories that twisted every squeak into a warning. It was exhausting, absurd, and deeply medieval. Rats were everywhere, and so were the tales about them, wrapping your trade in layers of meaning it never deserved. And as rats burrowed deeper into culture, they influenced more than just folklore. They began to shape the way people thought about health itself, fueling bizarre theories about disease, balance, and the invisible forces believed to govern the human body. Which meant that your miserable life as a rat catcher was not only tied to superstition, but also to the strange medical ideas that tried to explain why vermin thrived where people suffered. By now, superstition had tangled rats into folklore, but medicine did not escape their influence either. In an age when physicians believed your health depended on the balance of 4 bodily humours, it is no surprise that rats were drawn into the conversation. For medieval doctors, vermin were more than pests. They were symptoms, causes, metaphors, and sometimes even ingredients in treatments. And you, trudging through the muck with your sack of corpses, were providing specimens for a medical system that made as much sense as bleeding a fever out with leeches. The most common theory of disease in the Middle Ages was miasma, the idea that bad air caused sickness. The smell of rotting food, sewage, or dead animals was thought to spread illness like smoke from a fire. This is why fumigation was popular. People burned herbs, resins, and sometimes even aromatic woods in their homes, convinced that sweet-smelling air would keep disease away. Unfortunately, the rats crawling underfoot were doing far more damage than the stench above. Yet because rats always accompanied foul odours, they became linked in people's minds to the miasma itself. Killing rats was seen not only as pest control, but as an act of air purification. Medical texts occasionally reference vermin directly. Some physicians claimed rats bred spontaneously in filth, a belief inherited from ancient natural philosophy. To them, rats were not just creatures, but manifestations of corruption itself, living proof that rot created life from nothing. Others thought infestations revealed an imbalance of the environment, a sign that the world itself was sick in the same way a body could be. When doctors peered into households and saw rats chewing at bread, they diagnosed the home itself as diseased. But medieval medicine never stopped at observation. Rats themselves were sometimes used in remedies. Ground rat bones mixed with herbs were prescribed for stomach ailments in certain regions. Rat fat, rendered into a greasy ointment, was smeared onto wounds or sore joints, with predictable results. There are accounts of powdered rat mixed with wine offered as a cure for toothache, which was less a medical breakthrough and more a cruel joke on desperate patients. For you, this meant that some of your catches did not end up in pits or fires, but in apothecaries, where they were chopped, boiled, and bottled. Humoral theory gave further justification. Physicians argued that vermin flourished in places where excess moisture or heat threw off the balance of humours. Too much phlegm or black bile in the environment supposedly encouraged rat infestations. This meant that your work was interpreted not as a practical trade, but as a medical correction. You were rebalancing the humours of a household, one squeaking corpse at a time, even though your real contribution was mostly bruises and flea bites. Plague deepened these associations. When entire families died, doctors rarely admitted ignorance. Instead, they doubled down on theories of poisoned air and unbalanced humours. Rats became visual confirmation. their sudden deaths or mass swarms framed as indicators of bad air thickening around a neighbourhood. Physicians carried posies and vinegar-soaked cloths, but none of these kept the fleas from biting. You walked alongside them unknowingly, both of you parading ignorance, but only one of you had the decency to admit you were guessing. Hospitals, such as they were, did not escape infestation either. Rats ran freely through infirmaries, gnawing on supplies, nibbling at bandages, and carrying fleas from bed to bed. Physicians blamed the architecture, the patients, or the air, but rarely the rodents themselves. Meanwhile, the sick lay in rows, coughing into straw bedding that was shared with vermin as much as with caretakers. If your profession was despised in towns, it was doubly loathed near hospitals, where every appearance reminded physicians of their failure to drive the creatures out. At times, the absurdity became almost comic. Physicians prescribed carrying herbs in pouches to ward off miasma, while rats gnawed directly at their boots. Remedies involving rat parts were administered with solemn ceremony, as if a pest ground into powder held more power than common sense. The irony was sharp. You could be fined for failing to keep rats out of a granary, then watch a physician grind the same creature into a plaster for someone's aching tooth. In one corner, vermin were symbols of filth. In another, they were bottled as medicine. And of course, the people themselves carried their own beliefs about vermin health. Some swore that sleeping near rats made you ill, while others claimed the opposite, that vermin consumed disease before it reached you. There were families who tolerated rats in their homes for fear of angering the spirits that sent them, while others begged for you to purge every last one with fire. The contradictions piled up, and in the middle of them, you kept catching, carrying, and cursing your sack of fleas. The strangest part was how rats reshaped ideas about public health. Officials began to see infestations not only as nuisances, but as threats to the body of the city itself. Cleaning campaigns were framed in medical terms, as if purging refuse from the streets was surgery on an urban patient. Pest control became part of civic health, and you, the rat catcher, were reluctantly absorbed into the process. You were not just a filthy tradesman. You were part of a medical ecosystem that saw your work as vital as bloodletting or leeching, even if no one wanted to admit it out loud. By night's end, you returned home with fleas still biting, your clothes stinking, and your reputation unchanged. Rats had become a cornerstone of medieval medicine, shaping theories of disease, inspiring remedies, and fueling contradictions that made your life both profitable and miserable. You were not only a man catching vermin, you were unwittingly fueling an entire medical philosophy that could not survive without you. And just as rats shaped medicine, they also found their way into law courts, where trials of vermin became bizarre spectacles of medieval justice, which meant that your miserable trade was about to step into the absurd theatre of law, where even rats had their day before a judge. As if superstition and medicine had not already tangled your trade in absurdity, the law decided to take things even further. In medieval Europe, rats were not only hunted, trapped, and feared, they were also prosecuted. Entire colonies of rodents found themselves dragged into the theatre of human justice, accused of theft, destruction, and even spiritual corruption. It sounds unbelievable, but to medieval courts, vermin were not just animals. They were subjects under God's law, and therefore subject to man's law as well. The practice of animal trials was not unique to rats. Pigs that attacked children were sometimes hanged. Roosters accused of laying eggs were burned for witchcraft. But rats held a special place in this legal circus. They were among the most frequent defendants, dragged into proceedings that could stretch for weeks. As a rat catcher, you might have supplied the very culprits, only to watch as men in robes debated their guilt with a seriousness that bordered on parody. The charges were straightforward enough. Rats were accused of stealing grain, spoiling food stores, and spreading disease. Complaints were filed by farmers, towns, or monasteries, and judges agreed to hear the cases. Legal documents survive describing how entire colonies were summoned to court, given formal indictments, and even assigned defense lawyers. Yes, medieval society went so far as to pay human lawyers to argue on behalf of rodents. It was bureaucracy colliding with biology, and it produced results that were as comedic as they were tragic. One of the most famous examples comes from the 16th century France, where the lawyer Bartholomew Chassenet defended a group of rats accused of destroying barley crops. His argument was not that the rats were innocent. Instead, he claimed that the court summons had not been properly delivered, since the rodents lived scattered across a wide area. Furthermore, he argued, the rats could not safely attend court because of the danger posed by cats along the roads. The judge, remarkably, accepted this as a valid concern and postponed the trial. Weeks dragged into months as summons were reissued and excuses mounted. In the end, no rats appeared in court, which should not surprise anyone, and the case was quietly abandoned. These trials were not just eccentric theatre, they reflected a worldview in which all creatures, from humans to vermin, were part of a moral order. If rats broke that order by stealing grain, then justice demanded they be punished. Sentences varied. Sometimes rats were excommunicated from the church, a punishment that meant little to them, but carried symbolic weight for the people. Other times they were cursed publicly, with priests chanting anathemas to drive them away. And in some extreme cases, communities staged executions of captured vermin, hanging them from gallows or burning them in pits. These spectacles were as much about reassuring people as they were about punishing pests. For you, the rat catcher, these trials were both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, they kept the fear of vermin alive, ensuring steady work. On the other, they highlighted the absurdity of your trade. While you sweated in sewers swinging sticks at shadows, men in robes debated whether rats could legally attend court. It was a contrast so ridiculous that you could only laugh, though never too loudly, since laughter at the wrong moment could land you in trouble with the very authorities paying your wages. The theatre of rat justice often played out in churches. Trials might be conducted before altars, with clergy presiding. Rats, of course, never appeared, but that did not matter. The spectacle was for the people, a ritual meant to restore order in a world where infestations symbolized chaos. You could stand at the edge of the crowd, sack on your back, and watch as priests denounced creatures that were, at that very moment, gnawing at the bread in the monastery cellar. Legal records also reveal how seriously these proceedings were documented. Clerks recorded indictments, defences, and verdicts with the same care they gave to human trials. Entire volumes of parchment were dedicated to cataloguing cases against vermin. If you ever wondered how much time a society could waste on nonsense, the answer was written in careful Latin across centuries of archives. It was bureaucracy at its most theatrical, law wielded not as a tool of justice but as a performance of control. The irony was sharp. Courts might excommunicate rats or sentence them to banishment, but the creatures did not care. They returned to the same fields, barns and cellars, thriving in defiance of parchment and prayers. Every failed verdict made your work more necessary, but also more absurd. You could kill a dozen rats in the morning, then watch a judge declare in the afternoon that the rest had been legally expelled from the parish. And still, the scratching in the rafters never stopped. For the common people, these trials offered comfort. They made infestations feel manageable, as if vermin could be held accountable in the same way as thieves or murderers. It was psychological pest control, a ritual that reassured the community even as the real pests multiplied. For you, it was another reminder that your profession lived at the crossroads of practicality and farce. You fought a daily war with claws and teeth, while the courts fought imaginary battles with ink and curses. By the time night fell and you stumbled home, the absurdity of it all clung to you like the fleas on your legs. Rats were not only nuisances, omens and medical specimens. They were criminals in the eyes of the law, creatures dragged into trials that proved more about human insecurity than rodent behaviour. And while the judges pontificated and the lawyers argued, you remained the one trudging through the filth, still catching, still killing, still stinking. The courts might have pretended to drive rats out with words, but reality demanded harder measures. Which is why the next layer of your life as a rat catcher was not about law or superstition. but about the brutal physical methods used to control infestations on a larger scale. Methods that turned entire villages into battlefields against vermin, with traps, fires, and even animals drafted into the war. After watching courts attempt to excommunicate rats with ink and prayers, the next logical step was brute force. Communities frustrated with infestations that mocked laws and defied curses launched their own wars against vermin. These were not the precise efforts of professional catchers like you. They were clumsy, desperate, and often spectacularly counterproductive. Entire villages turned into battlegrounds with fire, traps, animals, and superstition drafted into service. And at the centre of it all, you were expected to lend your expertise, even if you knew from experience that rats always had the upper hand. The simplest campaigns were mass hunts. Towns declared a day for vermin purging, calling men, women and children to arm themselves with sticks, stones, and whatever crude weapons they could muster. Grain stores and barns were torn open, rats flushed into the open, and mobs swung wildly in pursuit. Dogs snapped, cats were thrown into piles of straw, and sometimes even ferrets were loosed en masse. The chaos was deafening, a mix of squeals, barks and shouts, as if the entire community had gone to war against an army of shadows. You stood among them, swinging your trapstick, knowing full well that by morning the survivors would be back, hungrier and bolder than ever. Fire was another favoured method. Villagers sealed up barns or homes suspected of heavy infestations and set them ablaze, convinced that the flames would purify both structure and soil. It worked in the sense that nothing survived, but it often left families homeless and food stores destroyed. Chronicles mention entire granaries lost to such purges, their smouldering remains a testament to desperation. You sometimes earned a coin for helping ignite these infernos, but you also knew you were watching wealth turn to ash, while rats scurried away through cracks unseen. Flooding was equally popular and equally disastrous. Wells, rivers, and even buckets of collected rainwater were dumped into cellars and holes in the ground to drown nests. The water often seeped into foundations, collapsing walls and rotting timber. Rats, being excellent swimmers, frequently emerged unscathed, paddling across the flood like furry sailors. The villagers cheered briefly at the sight of drowned bodies, only to realise that half the colony had survived and was now spreading to new homes, and you, knee-deep in muck, were called to finish the job with your ferret and your sack. Communities also turned to poison, though medieval poison was as crude as their medicine. Concoctions of arsenic, hellebore, or other toxic herbs were mixed into food and scattered in barns. Some mixtures worked, killing both rats and unfortunate livestock. Others barely slowed the vermin, who seemed able to digest substances that sickened humans. The worst cases ended with children or farmhands accidentally consuming the poison meant for rodents. Villagers cursed the rats louder than ever, but the true victims were often human. In cities, mass exterminations became theatrical. Officials organised rat-catching contests, offering rewards for the largest haul. Catchers dragged sacks into squares, spilling piles of twitching vermin before clerks counted tails and bodies. Crowds gathered as if for sport, turning pest control into public spectacle. The losers of these contests were often mocked, while the winners earned temporary glory before returning to their squalid lives. You sometimes competed in these events, though victory was hollow. Fame lasted a single evening, but fleas clung to you for weeks. Animals were also conscripted into the war. Dogs and ferrets were obvious choices, but cats were praised as natural defenders, their presence encouraged in barns and monasteries. Owls were sometimes captured and tethered near grain stores to frighten vermin, though rats quickly learned to ignore the birds once they were chained. In some regions, even pigs were used, their rooting habits employed to dig out burrows. It was medieval creativity at its finest, which is to say it was haphazard, messy, and often more dangerous to the humans involved than to the rodents themselves. The futility of these campaigns became clear with numbers. A female rat can produce litters of up to a dozen offspring every few weeks. Entire colonies could double in size within months, thriving on scraps and grain. No amount of community hunting or burning could match that pace. You could watch villagers swing their sticks until their arms ached, only to hear the scratching begin again that same evening. Rats bred faster than humans could kill, and every attempt to exterminate them only highlighted the imbalance. Superstition crept into these campaigns as well. Priests were invited to bless hunts, sprinkling holy water on barns before the purging began. Processions marched through streets carrying relics, chanting prayers to drive out vermin. Some villages even rang bells continuously, believing the noise would frighten rats into leaving. It rarely worked, but the ritual gave people the illusion of control, even as the creatures darted across their feet. You learned to accept these theatrics with a grim smile, knowing that your traps would be needed again tomorrow. For you, these mass efforts were exhausting. They blurred the line between professional and communal work, demanding that you risk your body in chaotic hunts or help ignite dangerous fires. The coin was often poor, the gratitude short-lived, and the results temporary. Yet refusing to participate risked angering the same people who hired you. So you swung your stick alongside them, burned barns, flooded cellars, and counted tails, knowing all the while that the rats would return. They always did. By the end of these campaigns, villages were often poorer, hungrier, and angrier than before. Food was destroyed, homes damaged, and infestations merely displaced. Rats, adaptable as ever, slipped back into the cracks, waiting for the frenzy to pass. And when it did, you were once again left to do the quiet, dirty work of crawling, catching, and cursing in solitude. But the futility of these wars revealed something important. Rats were not only enemies to be hunted, they were reminders of how fragile medieval society truly was. The very structures meant to protect food, shelter families, and provide security were the same ones that gave vermin endless opportunities. Which meant that your miserable life as a rat catcher was not only about battling rodents, but about living in a world where human survival was constantly on the edge of collapse. And if mass extermination showed how desperate communities could be, the toll they took on your own body revealed just how much misery came with the profession. Because every scratch, every flea bite, every day spent in filth left its mark on your health, your clothing, and your skin. The community hunts ended, the fires smouldered, and the rats retreated into the walls to breed again. But while the vermin thrived, your body paid the price. Catching rats was never only about dirt under your nails or the smell clinging to your cloak. It was about what the job carved into your skin, your lungs, your stomach, and even your bones. Medieval rat catchers did not simply age, they decayed while still breathing, carrying the marks of their profession in every scar, rash, and cough. The first and most constant torment was the flea. Rats carried them in countless numbers, hopping from fur to fabric with every squeak. Your legs itched endlessly, swollen with red welts from bites that never healed. Fleas carried more than discomfort. They carried plague, typhus, and other illnesses that burned through communities. You were bitten daily, sometimes hundreds of times, a walking buffet for parasites that turned your blood into their currency. To scratch was pointless. Your skin became a permanent map of bites, rashes, and scabs, a record of every sack you carried and every burrow you crawled into. Then there were the rats themselves. Trapping them was one thing, handling them was another. They bit with sharp teeth, leaving wounds that swelled, festered, and often rotted into infections. Without modern medicine, even the smallest cut could lead to disaster. Rat bites sometimes transmitted diseases like leptospirosis, which attack the kidneys and liver, leaving victims feverish and jaundiced. For a catcher, it was not a question of if you would be bitten, but how many times before the wound crippled you. Scars patterned your arms and hands like a badge of a trade no one admired. The filth of the job added another layer. You crawled through sewage-filled alleys, barns soaked in animal dung, and sewers slick with waste. every scrape risked infection. Cellulitis, boils and abscesses were constant companions, swelling into painful lumps that slowed your movements and drained your strength. Some catchers lost fingers or toes to infections that spread unchecked, while others carried on with permanent limp or stiffness. Your body was a battlefield, and the rats were not the only enemy. Your lungs did not escape either. Dust, mould, and smoke from burning carcasses clogged them day after day. Grain stores filled with spores could cause coughing fits that never seemed to end. Some rat catchers likely suffered from what we would now call farmer's lung, a chronic illness caused by breathing in mouldy particles. In an age without treatment, it meant constant wheezing, coughing blood, and dying young. Even if you survived plague, you might spend your final years gasping for air like a man drowning on dry land. Food did little to help. Rat catchers were rarely paid well, and coin often stretched only to stale bread, thin pottage, or watered ale. Malnutrition weakened your immune system, leaving your body less able to fight the constant barrage of parasites and infections. Your teeth rotted early, your gums swelled, and your bones ached from lack of nutrients. While others complained of hunger in lean winters, you carried hunger year-round, always at the edge of collapse. The irony of protecting food stores while starving yourself was never lost on you. Clothing too worked against you. Ragged wool cloaks, rarely washed, became breeding grounds for lice, fleas, and mites. Your garments smelled permanently of mildew, sweat, and decay. Washing was rare, and soap was expensive, so layers of filth built up until your very presence in a tavern drove others away. To be a rat catcher was to be a living warning sign, your body announcing your trade before your mouth ever spoke. You were marked not only by scars, but by stench, a walking reminder of the vermin you pursued. The mental toll was just as sharp. Nights were sleepless, filled with phantom scratching and imagined bites. Every squeak in the dark kept you awake, listening, waiting, never able to rest. Anxiety gnawed at your mind as surely as rats gnawed through wood. Many catchers drank heavily, numbing their nerves with ale or stronger brews. Others simply wore down, their tempers short, their faces hollow. You were despised not only for your work, but for the look of exhaustion it carved into your features. Appearance was another casualty. Constant exposure to filth aged you early. By your mid-20s, your skin was weathered, your hair thinned, and your teeth cracked or missing. Catchers rarely reached old age, but when they did, they looked like men decades older. Children pointed at your scars and adults held their noses, but no one mistook you for anything other than what you were. The profession branded you as surely as any mark or chain might. And yet, despite all of this, you persisted. The fleas bit, the wounds festered, the coughs tore at your chest, and still you returned to crawl into the dark. Because society demanded it. Because food had to be protected. Because plague had to be kept at bay, even if only an illusion. Your body paid the price so that others could sleep, eat, and pretend the scratching in the rafters was not as loud as it truly was. The physical misery of your trade was undeniable, but as much as it scarred your body, it also shaped your place in society. For people did not simply see your wounds and stench, they judged you for them, branding you with suspicion, avoidance, and contempt. Which meant the next layer of your miserable life was not just what rats did to your health, but what people did to your reputation. Your skin bore the scars of bites, your lungs rattled from smoke, and your body ached from crawling through filth. But the punishment did not stop with your health. It followed you into every social space, every tavern, every church pew, and every marketplace. To be a medieval rat catcher was to carry a reputation as permanent as the stench in your clothes. You were not just a man who killed vermin. You were vermin adjacent, tolerated only when necessary, avoided whenever possible, and forever marked as unclean. Medieval society placed enormous weight on reputation and smell. Occupations that reeked of filth were automatically pushed to the margins. Tanners, butchers, gong farmers, and rat catchers were all considered necessary but dishonourable. The difference was that tanners made leather, butchers provided meat, and gong farmers carted away waste. Rat catchers delivered nothing tangible. Your only proof of usefulness was a sack of corpses that stank worse than you did. People relied on you in silence, but no one wanted to be seen walking too close. In taverns, your presence was enough to empty a bench. The wool of your cloak held the scent of mildew and rat urine, so strong that even the smoke of cheap ale fires could not mask it. The alewife might serve you reluctantly, but often in a cracked cup no one else used. Some taverns refused service outright, fearing your smell would cling to the room and drive away other customers. You were condemned to drink standing in corners, your back to the wall, the laughter of others ringing in your ears while you sipped watery ale in solitude. Churches treated you with equal suspicion. To sit in a pew was to risk whispers about whether you carried plague. Priests sometimes blessed you after payment, muttering prayers to cleanse the air around you as though God himself needed protection from your odour. In some regions, rat catchers were seated near the back, alongside beggars and lepers, a silent reminder that salvation was stratified even within the walls of stone sanctuaries. Your work was technically holy in its defence against pestilence, yet your body was treated as profane. Marriage prospects were almost non-existent. Families rarely offered their daughters to men who stank of fleas and vermin. Even among the poorest peasants, a rat catcher was seen as an unclean match, good enough for desperate unions, but not for families seeking even the faintest upward climb. Some catchers never married at all, living out their years alone, accompanied only by the scratching in their sacks and the growling of their dogs. Others married fellow outcasts, pairing misery with misery in huts that reeked of decay. Children, always quick to mock, shouted insults when you passed. They mimicked squeaks, held their noses and ran behind you laughing, as though your profession was a joke they could afford to ridicule. Adults often said little, but their faces tightened, their eyes narrowed, and their hands pulled their children aside. To be near you was to risk being touched by something contagious, even if they knew nothing of bacteria or fleas. The association was instinctive, primal, and unshakable. Guilds offered no sanctuary. Rat catchers never formed organised guilds in the way butchers, blacksmiths, or carpenters did. Your trade was too filthy, too despised, too transient to earn the protection of formal recognition. This left you on the fringes of labour, often bargaining alone for wages, unable to protest when cheated or scorned. You were as unprotected socially as you were physically, crawling into holes with nothing but your dog while guildmasters in clean aprons debated prices in halls warmed by fire. Even your payment carried stigma. Coins offered for your services were sometimes dropped on the ground, or placed on tables with cloth so hands would not touch. Bread given as a reward was stale or burned, scraps from loaves no one else wanted. Beer poured for you was the dregs of a barrel, thick with sediment. It was not generosity. It was disposal disguised as payment, as though every exchange was a chance to remind you of your low standing. The irony was sharp. People needed you desperately. Without you, their food spoiled, their children risked disease, their markets collapsed. Yet this dependence only sharpened their disdain. To them, you were a reminder of the fragility of life, the constant presence of filth and plague, the scratching in the walls they could not escape. They did not want to see you because you embodied the problem, and so they paid you, avoided you, and whispered about you in equal measure. Occasionally legends offered rare glimpses of admiration. Rat catchers were sometimes portrayed in folk tales as clever tricksters, outwitting vermin with cunning instead of force. But even in these tales, the admiration was backhanded. You were still the man in the mud, the one others laughed at behind closed doors. The admiration was for your ingenuity, not your dignity. Your dignity was stripped away every time a tavern cleared a table or a child pinched their nose. Your social position was a paradox. You were vital and despised, essential and exiled, paid and mocked. You lived in a liminal space between community and filth, survival and shame. Each day you carried your sack of rats through towns that barely tolerated your presence. and each night you lay awake in a hut that smelled of decay. You belonged everywhere and nowhere, as invisible in life as the fleas that made your work so necessary. And as society mocked you, it also demanded you adapt. To survive, you needed better tools, sharper traps, and cleverer methods, which meant the next layer of your miserable existence was shaped not by stigma alone, but by the constant struggle to improve your craft with the few resources available. The stink of avoidance followed you through town, but when the insults quieted and the whispers faded, you still had a job to do. And that job depended on tools, not fine instruments forged by guildsmiths or polished weapons carried by knights. Yours were crude, improvised, and often barely functional. The life of a rat catcher was shaped not only by fleas and filth, but also by sticks, traps, ropes, and animals that served as your reluctant allies in a war you were never meant to win. The most iconic tool of your trade was the trap. Wooden boards fitted with simple springs, baited with scraps of bread, cheese, or rancid meat, stood as the front line of medieval pest control. They rarely worked as intended. Springs rusted, wood warped, and bait spoiled before vermin arrived. Some rats grew clever, learning to eat around the trigger without setting it off. The traps became symbols of frustration, monuments to ingenuity undermined by the adaptability of vermin. You set them anyway, because having a tool that sometimes worked was better than having none at all. Cage traps offered another approach. These wooden boxes snapped shut when a rat wandered inside, lured by the smell of food. In theory, they allowed catchers to transport rats alive, useful for selling them into bloodsport or presenting them as evidence for bounties. In practice, rats bit through slats, gnawed their way to freedom, or simply refused to take the bait. More than one catcher found himself carrying an empty cage back to town, mocked by the very creatures he was supposed to defeat. Animals were the most reliable tools, though they came with their own complications. Small terrier dogs were bred specifically for vermin control, snapping up rats with frightening efficiency. They became both companions and workers, snarling into haystacks and pulling wriggling prey from burrows. Their loyalty was unquestioned, but their appetite for fleas was non-existent. Dogs scratched, whined, and carried their own infestations, turning them into itchy allies at best. Still, a good terrier could kill dozens of rats in a single night, which made them invaluable, even if they stank as badly as their masters. Ferrets were the secret weapons. Long, slender, and relentless, they could be shoved into burrows and walls, flushing rats into the open. The Romans had once used ferrets for hunting rabbits, and medieval catchers adapted the practice for vermin. Farmers marvelled at their speed, though ferrets had their own ideas about loyalty. Some vanished into walls, never to return. Others emerged carrying fleas, their fur crawling with the same parasites you were trying to avoid. You could not afford to lose them. So many catchers tethered their ferrets with small cords, yanking them out if they lingered too long. It was a system that worked half the time, and half the time ended with you staring at a hole, cursing softly into the dark. Poisons entered your toolkit as well, though they were more often supplied by apothecaries than made by catchers themselves. Herbs like hellebore or wolfsbane were ground into powders, mixed with bread, and left as bait. Arsenic was sometimes used, though its danger to humans and livestock made it a risky choice. Poison did not discriminate. Chickens pecked at it, dogs licked it, and children occasionally consumed it by mistake. For every rat poisoned, there was the chance of killing something far more valuable. Yet desperation kept poisons in use, and you were sometimes the one ordered to scatter them, praying no one cursed your name when accidents followed. Improvised weapons filled the gaps. Clubs carved from branches, boots used for stomping, and shovels swung in dim barns became part of the profession. A rat catcher's toolkit was not a polished chest of instruments, but a patchwork of whatever was at hand. Villagers sometimes joined in with their own creations, from makeshift nets to crude slings designed to hurl stones at vermin. The results were mixed, but the spirit of desperation was always the same. Your clothing functioned as armour of sorts. Thick leather gloves, when you could afford them, protected hands from bites. Heavy boots guarded your ankles from sharp teeth. Cloaks layered with rough wool were less about warmth and more about shielding skin from scratches. None of it was particularly effective. Rats bit through leather, fleas crawled through wool, and boots filled with mud until they squelched with every step. Yet without these layers you were even more vulnerable, so you endured the heat, the itch, and the stink for the sake of survival. The most unusual part of your toolkit was the use of sound. Bells, whistles, and rattles were sometimes carried to frighten rats from hiding places. Villagers believed loud noise drove vermin away, and catchers occasionally employed these tools to flush out nests. The reality was less impressive. Rats quickly adapted, learning to ignore clanging bells or simply scurrying deeper into walls. Still, the performance gave employers confidence, and that alone was worth the charade. You learned to shake your rattle with conviction, even if you knew the only thing leaving the barn was dignity. The limits of your tools forced innovation. Rat catchers traded ideas, sharing tales of traps that worked for one village and failed miserably in another. Some experimented with smoke, lighting straw and forcing rats into the open, though this often ended in accidental fires. Others claimed success with mixtures of herbs meant to repel vermin, though rats seemed indifferent to most aromas. You learned that the only consistent truth of the trade was inconsistency itself. Tools broke, poisons failed, animals disobeyed, and yet the work continued. Your arsenal was not noble, but it was all that stood between order and chaos in the granary, the barn, and the street. Tools defined your existence, shaping how you hunted, how you worked, and how often you survived. Yet as important as your weapons were, they were only part of the story. The true weight of your profession lay in its economy, in the coin you earned, the scams that surrounded it, and the strange market that turned vermin into currency. The worth of your labour was measured not in pride or prestige, but in coin that barely jingled when dropped into your palm. Rat catching was not a calling so much as a transaction, and the medieval economy made sure you were always the last in line for payment. The money did not flow easily, and when it did, it came with suspicion, bargaining, and often outright exploitation. You were hired for necessity, never respect. Villages and towns occasionally organised bounty systems to reward rat catchers, with payments issued per tale delivered. The logic was simple. No one wanted a sack of decomposing rats hauled into town square so tales became proof of the catch. But that logic created opportunities for corruption. Some catchers salted their sacks with tales collected over weeks, handing the same ones in multiple times. Others bought tales from desperate peasants who killed rats themselves, pocketing the bounty at a profit. A few clever cheats even carved tales from other animals to pass them off as vermin-proof. To the untrained eye, a rabbit tail stripped and trimmed looked convincing enough to earn coin. Payment varied depending on who employed you. Farmers offered a few pennies, sometimes only bread or beer, for ridding barns of vermin. Town councils occasionally funded larger campaigns, paying catchers to clear marketplaces, granaries or docks. These jobs promised higher pay but attracted competition, leading to squabbles between catchers, each accusing the other of cutting corners or planting rats to increase the scale of infestation. Records survive of councils fining rat catchers for fraud, though the temptation to cheat was always greater than the fear of punishment. After all, no one was auditing rat populations with accuracy. The problem with the trade was that the better you were at it, the less work there was. A barn cleared of vermin meant fewer coins tomorrow. The irony of your profession was that success bred unemployment, while failure ensured steady work. Catchers learned to manage infestations rather than eradicate them, leaving just enough vermin alive to guarantee a return visit. Employers suspected this, but desperation outweighed mistrust. A farmer with grain bins gnawed open could not afford principle, only results, however temporary they might be. Strange barter systems developed around your work. Rats were more than pests. They became a kind of grim currency. Cats were bartered in exchange for services, prized not as pets, but as biological pest control. Some towns even measured the value of imported grain against the number of rats it attracted, adjusting prices accordingly. A sack of barley that survived the week untouched was worth more than one already perforated by teeth. The rat catcher's ability to influence these markets gave you an odd kind of leverage, though never enough to lift you from the bottom rungs of society. At fairs and festivals, rat catchers sometimes made side money by staging entertainment. A sack of live rats could be emptied into a ring, where terriers were unleashed to slaughter them while crowds cheered. These rat-baiting spectacles foreshadowed blood sports of later centuries and gave you the chance to turn vermin into spectacle. Admission fees, bets, and the sale of refreshments lined the pockets of organisers, though the catcher himself often received only scraps of profit. It was a reminder that even when your work entertained, you remained expendable. The church occasionally entered the economy of vermin control, though in its own peculiar way. Priests sometimes organised rat excommunications, where vermin were formally cursed or banished through ritual. Payment for these ceremonies came not to the rat catcher but to the clergy, who claimed spiritual authority over infestations. Records describe bizarre scenes where rats were summoned to court, assigned legal representation, and threatened with divine punishment if they did not depart. It was theatre, not pest control, but the church claimed its fee nonetheless. You were left to clean up afterward, earning little more than the bitter knowledge that you were less respected than vermin with a lawyer. The wages themselves reflected your lowly place in society. A skilled mason could earn sixpence a day, a carpenter perhaps a little less. A rat catcher often received half that, and sometimes no money at all. Payment in kind was common: stale bread, a jug of ale, or a patch of ragged clothing thrown your way as compensation. These tokens kept you alive but never comfortable. Your poverty was built into the profession, ensuring that no matter how many rats you killed, you remained trapped in the same cycle as the creatures you hunted. Economics also defined your relationships with employers. Trust was scarce, and contracts were nearly non-existent. Everything was negotiated verbally, often with threats of withheld payment if results disappointed. Some employers tried to bargain down your fee after the work was done, claiming you missed nests or failed to reduce numbers enough. Others simply refused to pay, leaving you no recourse but to accept the loss. After all, what standing did a rat catcher have in court? You were more likely to be laughed out of the room than granted justice. Scams worked in both directions, and some catchers leaned into their reputation for cunning. Stories circulate of men releasing rats into barns at night, only to return by day offering their services. These schemes were risky but effective, ensuring a constant flow of work. Of course, discovery meant exile or worse, but hunger has a way of dulling the sense of risk. The temptation to manufacture infestations was as constant as the scurrying in the walls. The true wealth in rat catching was not money but survival. You survived the fleas, the bites, the insults, and the endless suspicion of fraud. Your profession existed in the margins, tolerated only when necessary and despised the moment it was not. The economy of vermin control reflected the economy of medieval life itself, unstable, corrupt, and cruelly balanced in favour of those above. The rat catcher scraped by, earning just enough to return the next day, his work unending, his value forever questioned. And yet, for all its indignities, the economy of your profession touched nearly every aspect of medieval life. It shaped the grain markets, influenced employment, and even entered the realm of entertainment and faith. The rats themselves were never truly eliminated, only contained, and in that containment lay the peculiar economy of survival. But as much as money defined your profession, it was the cultural perception of your role that ensured your misery was complete. To understand the weight of being a rat catcher, one must look not only at what you were paid, but how you were seen. No matter how essential your work may have been, your reputation stank almost as much as the sacks you carried. A rat catcher was never seen as noble or honest. but rather as a creature straddling the line between man and vermin. In a world steeped in superstition, your very presence unsettled people. You dealt with things no one else wanted to touch, and for that you were marked as someone different, perhaps even dangerous. The sight of you wandering into a marketplace with your sack of squirming cargo drew stares and whispers. Parents yanked children away from your path as though fleas might leap from your coat onto their little ones. Merchants held their noses, not only at the smell of your work, but at the thought of contagion clinging to your skin. Even when you had finished a job, cleared a barn and hauled away its rodents, suspicion lingered. Did you truly rid the place of vermin, or did you hold some unholy pact with them, commanding them as easily as you destroyed them? Folklore sharpened this suspicion. In Germanic and Eastern European towns, stories circulated of rat catchers who could lure vermin with magical pipes or chants. The most famous tale later crystallized into the legend of the Pied Piper of Hamelin. But long before it was wrapped in children's rhyme, it was whispered as a dark warning. The implication was that a rat catcher's gift was unnatural, that you were not merely skilled but touched by something sinister. Rats, after all, were thought to be aligned with demons and witches, so anyone who claimed control over them fell under the same shadow. Superstition went further than mere unease. In many villages, you were treated as a potential bringer of plague rather than its solution. Rats carried fleas, fleas carried disease, and since you handled both daily, you became a walking embodiment of danger. Some believed you spread pestilence on purpose, feeding off the desperation of those who would hire you again and again. In times of outbreak, suspicion turned to outright hostility. If sickness rose after your visit, you became the scapegoat, accused of trafficking with devils or poisoning wells. In some cases, catchers were chased out of towns, pelted with stones, or even executed for supposed witchcraft. Your trade placed you at the thin edge between necessity and persecution. The association with witchcraft was not entirely unfounded in the eyes of medieval society. You carried strange tools, concocted pungent poisons, and dealt with creatures that seemed immortal in their numbers. Recipes for vermin-killing powders often involved substances that looked and smelled sinister: ground henbane, arsenic-laced flour, or quicklime mixed with milk. Villagers who saw you sprinkle such powders believed you were casting spells rather than practicing crude chemistry. When rats died en masse, it looked like sorcery. When they inevitably returned, it looked like proof of your failed pact with darker forces. Despite the distrust, there was a grudging fascination with your work. Children whispered about you as though you were a figure from folklore, half monster and half man, creeping into barns at night to battle armies of teeth and tails. Adults repeated rumours that you could speak to the rats, that you knew secret whistles which made them follow you willingly. These stories gave you an aura of power, even if it was laced with fear. Your role became part of the oral tradition of the Middle Ages, sitting somewhere between fact and fable. The irony was that while villagers whispered about your dealings with vermin, they relied on you constantly. Farmers knew that without your intervention, their grain would vanish. Bakers knew their flour would turn to dust under gnawing teeth. Innkeepers understood that a single rat spotted in a pantry could ruin their trade. Yet none of them wanted to acknowledge this reliance openly. To admit the rat catcher's importance was to admit the weakness of their own homes against the creeping tide of vermin. It was easier to ridicule you in public, pay you in secret, and then whisper suspicions once you were gone. Your reputation was not helped by your appearance. Rat catchers were rarely wealthy enough to dress well, and the nature of the job meant your clothes were ragged, torn by traps and stained by the grime of barns and sewers. Some wore hoods to obscure their faces, both to avoid recognition and to hide the stench that clung to their hair. These hoods made you look more sinister, a shadowy figure skulking at the edge of town. Even when you tried to appear respectable, the sack of writhing vermin at your side undid the effort. Nothing said, "Trust me," less than the sound of scratching claws and squealing cries leaking from a burlap bag. The cultural contempt also extended into art and literature. Rats were drawn in manuscripts as symbols of gluttony, greed, or sin. To be associated with them was to be tainted by the same vices. Bestiaries of the period rarely spared kind words for the creatures, and by extension, they spared none for those who chased them. Catchers were lumped alongside other marginal trades, like dung collectors, hangmen, and grave diggers, people whose work was essential but socially reviled. You were the butt of jokes, the warning in sermons, the example parents used when scolding lazy children. Work hard, or you'll end up like the rat man. Superstitions occasionally turned your role into ritual. In parts of France, rat catchers were summoned not only to kill vermin, but to perform symbolic expulsions, parading through streets with drums or horns while carrying rats aloft on poles. The spectacle resembled a carnival, blending pest control with performance. It was believed that noise and ritual could frighten vermin into leaving, and you became the shaman-like figure at the centre of this absurd theatre. Payment for such performances was meagre, but the memory lingered in community lore. Once again, you were both entertainment and menace, your profession never able to escape its ambiguous place. In this way, the rat catcher lived trapped in cultural contradiction. You were feared but hired, mocked but needed, whispered about in folklore and cursed in sermons. To exist in medieval society was to accept that your name carried the same stink as your sacks, forever linked with vermin in the minds of those who watched you pass. The rats themselves never judged you, never whispered, never hurled stones. But the people did, and that was the greater weight you carried, heavier than any sack of tails. If you enjoyed listening to the scratching of rats in the walls of history, let me know in the comments which kind of suffering you'd like me to narrate next. Maybe it's knights with hemorrhoids, maybe it's monks with mouldy bread, or maybe something even worse. And if you can't get enough of humanity's long record of poor decisions and personal discomfort, check out my other videos too. There's always more historical suffering waiting to tuck you in.